I grew up in Brisbane, in Queensland, in Australia, in the 1970s. Uh, and I grew up in a very suburban landscape. But the thing about my parents is that they were owner builders, and I never really lived in a finished house, if you know what I mean. Like Dad was building the house around us, and my parents lived that way really for their entire marriage, even until Dad died. They bought a large property after that, and they started building again. And Dad was like the greatest sort of owner builder. He just couldn't see the sense in getting somebody else to do something that he could do himself. And so that was the environment that I grew up in. And my mum won't admit it, but she was actually very creative, and she could draw very well. And my father, in another time would have been an engineer, I think, if he had have had access to the kind of education that, you need to be called it formally, because that's really what he could do without the formal education. So, yeah, anything to do with building motors, engines, cars, anything at all. He was really, really extraordinary. And I think, a lot of his friends a lot of their friends, must have been laughing at them, because, it was what the Rileys were off doing again. Oh, here they go again. Dad had a rider mower, but he installed a radio on it and put, headphones on. So, he'd be seen, mowing his lawn with his headphones on. Like completely a bit sort of Wallace and Gromity,
Wallace
sort
and
of with
Gromit.
these own little inventions.
That's a cracking reference. That's a good reference. Yeah.
I know. And my dad unfortunately died over 20 years ago, and he got to see some work of mine, and he was very proud of what I did. But I don't think he really realized properly just how similar we are, like the whole sort of building thing, and, being very hands-on and all that sort of stuff. I didn't fall very far from the tree at all. So I'm really kind of proud of that.
So when you were a kid growing up in an environment of houses continually being under construction, but was that like an obvious thing to you, that you would go down a path that's sort of related, or it was just there?
Well, I think the thing that Mum and Dad taught me is I always had respect for people who could build. Like I've never had any snobbery about that whatsoever. Like I always really admire people who are doing things for themselves and just trying to sort it out, if you know what I mean. Like Dad was always tinkering and working stuff out, and Mum was always completely supporting him in doing that. And I was an only child, so I was kind of like their flatmate, I think. Mum kind of, like, they were just so tight in themselves that I often wonder whether I kind of got in the way. And and I was just kind of this kid, and the kid had to kind of do what they were doing. And so, it was an interesting world, but I was am a very good drawer. Okay. And that was the thing, is that Deborah could draw. And so I was very lucky insofar as they didn't see that as being in any way odd or unusual. So if I needed colouring in pencils, or if I needed to go and do a course in something or whatever, anything to further my art, they really they were so good at promoting that. Like they were really, really extraordinary. And in the kind of suburban life that I grew up in, I think that was really unusual. And right through to me, when I went and studied architecture, it was about the art, but also the science. They were still keen that I keep the art, and because I had been thinking about doing medicine for a bit, and then it kind of was like, no, but you've got your art. Like your art has to be the thing that you answer to.
That's awesome.
And I think that's really courageous.
Yeah. I mean, it's more. I mean, if you have parents, I find that if people have parents who are both artists, then it makes sense that they would want that or allow for that. But oftentimes, if a person's parents don't have an art background or they don't do it professionally, then there's a strong tendency toward like maths, science, those kinds of things,
sure.
engineering, accounting, or a doctor, which is a very reputable thing to do. But Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. So how did you make the decision to study architecture?
Yeah, I don't, how you can look back, the saying is something about, when you look back, you can connect all the dots, but at the time you've got no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of the case with me. I was very strong academically, even as I say, even though I came from this little suburban existence, academics was very important. So I sort of had quite a strong sort of science math thing, but then my exceptional ability was clearly the art. So architecture seemed like a good fusion of that. But I have to say that I didn't really know what architecture was. I have to admit, now that I understand, I really realize how naive I was. And when I enrolled at the University of Queensland in their architecture school, I think I was very fortunate because it was actually a very good school. And they sort of taught me quickly what I didn't know, if you know what I mean. Like they were very, they didn't sort of mince their words. I was told once that a plan that I drew looked like I'd dropped a pizza on it. Like they were very
That sounds like architecture school.
Yeah. But you know what? I mean, I kind of, we laugh about it now, but I'm kind of grateful for it because I really needed to sharpen up my act. But after 3 years of the architecture, I realized that maybe architecture in its pure form wasn't for me. And so, I had been to see Batman Returns, weirdly, and I remember looking at it and just thinking, who does that? Like, what is that? And like it's architecture, but not. So I went back to my school and I went back to the career guides, before the internet. And looked up where to study stage design. And in Australia, there's not many options, but one of them was at our National Theatre School. And so I studied stage design there. And so I learned how to study, or I learned about stage design for the theatre, but I had no idea that, you could apply that to film, or I didn't know how to do that at all. And there was a tiny little unit that we did on film design, but it really wasn't worth talking about. NIDA, as it's known, the National Institute of Dramatic Art, was very theatre focused and very proud of it. So only when sort of Baz Luhrmann and Kate Blanchett and, Mel Gibson had been through there before, there was some big sort of film people who were coming out of there, but it never took its focus off theatre. So when we ended up in what would it have been the mid-90s, I guess, mid to late 90s, there were a lot of American productions coming to Australia, and there weren't enough crew here to be able to cope. And so I was lucky because I had studied architecture. I obviously knew how to draft, and because I'd been at this theatre school, I understood sort of the dramatics of stage design, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So and the dramaturgy of it. So I was a natural fit, and so that was the first film that I worked on was called The Matrix, the very first Matrix. And I was a set designer on that.
So
I think I heard about
it. So I sort of landed on my feet without, and I just thought this is some sort of weird kung fu movie. I have no idea what this is. And I remember really clearly being taken down to the workshop by the supervising art director, who was interviewing me. And, there was this massive fiberglass helicopter hanging from the rafters. And I remember just saying, Michelle, what is this? And she said, it's a feature film. And I was like, wow, and then I never worked in theatre again. That was it.
Yeah. The allure. That's amazing. So,
well, then the great thing about film, sorry to interrupt, the great thing about film is it's a great kind of, there's all the technology and all of there is actually quite a lot of science in it. But it's obviously very creative. Like it's not, you have to use both sides of your brain. So it was a good fit in the end.
That's a crazy story. So I want to ask real quick. So in architecture school, was there a certain point, or how did you realize that it wasn't going to be for you? Did you feel like it was too real, like the constraints of reality, or?
I had a boyfriend at the time who was really good at it. And I remember just looking at him and just thinking, whatever it is that he has, I don't have. And I'm an insanely competitive person. It's not necessarily seen as being a great trait, particularly in women, but I am really competitive. And I just used to sort of narrow my eyes at Scott and just think, like, what is it that, how can he do this? And I just thought, you know what, maybe this isn't my bag. And my grandmother had also said to me that she thought I was drawing too many straight lines. So I think a combination of the two. I thought, and then by the time I saw Batman Returns, and I just never really thought about it before. I mean, like most people, I don't think you really think about how movies are made. I mean, today it's very different because you've got all the making ofs and all that sort of stuff.
True.
But back then, you really didn't know, didn't really have a clue. And besides which, and again, you've got to remember, I'm in Brisbane, Australia. That sort of stuff happens in America.
Right. Right.
It seemed so far away. So why would I think I could do that? So my career is sort of evolved by stepping sideways.
Mm-hmm.
I just sort of kept moving slightly off until eventually I think I found what I'm actually good at.
So when you transitioned and you were studying for the set design in the theater space, were there certain things that you would learn from architecture school that carried over beyond, let's say, you already had a good hand, it sounds like, but beyond the kind of technical skill sets, maybe I'm thinking even more specifically the conceptual aspects of architecture? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think I use the skills that I picked up in architecture every day when I'm working on a film far more than the work that I did when I was, learning theatre. Well, I mean, the two of them are combined, but architecture is so important. And I will hire people who studied architecture before I will hire anybody else because they're such important skills. Mm-hmm. And the most important one, and we had a subject that was called Behaviour and Environment Studies, which I guess is like the psychology of space stuff. I think it's, most architecture schools have it in some sort of form. And so for me, it's all about that. It's all about what kind of space suits what kind of emotion that a character is going through. So it's sort of the dramaturgy from the theatre, but it's all of the applications of, the emotional side of architecture that I use every day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally does. It totally does.
Yeah. And I think too, the history of architecture and just having an idea about a vocabulary for speaking about space and materials and, just how to talk to people about it. I mean, it's really important. And that I think you pick up from a very formal training. Yeah. I'm sure you guys would agree.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm also a little bit biased since I did a lot of school and I taught for a period of time. So I tend to think that there are things that, I mean, there are exceptions, of course. There are people who can pick up those skills and become very successful and very good architects, but that's, typically like the 0.1% of human beings, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, look, the Tadeo Andos of the world.
Exactly, that's the reference everyone uses. Well, he didn't do training. I'm like, yeah, but that's him.
Yeah, he's clearly exceptional. Yeah, look, but for me, and I came to it very late as well, So for a lot of because I will always go and speak to schools or to film schools or, high schools or whatever. Like if anybody wants me to come and chat, I'll come to chat. And the thing that I try and tell people is like, there's no hurry. It's okay. Like anything that sort of keeps you moving towards it is valuable. You don't have to hit it first go.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
So, it's okay. You too, and your design career and your design knowledge, like it evolves as you evolve. And I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, that's well said. So you're in school learning set design, and then you end up on the Matrix. So actually, maybe one thing that would be helpful is, because we're not in the film industry, and I think a lot of people listening might not know this also, like what is the difference between being a set designer versus I forget the title already, the head kind of art person you mentioned?
Yeah, production designer.
Production designer. Yeah. Like what are the different titles mean? Set designer versus production designer specifically, or anything else that would help us understand?
Yeah, the art department, well, first of all, working on a film is like, being in the military in a way, insofar as everybody has very clear roles. And, it's a meritocracy. And, the whole idea of it is that you work up through the ranks and you don't skip any steps along the way. You have to sort of enter sort of at the lowest level, and then you work your way up. So for me, I was lucky. I did sort of skip the very early steps because I'd done architecture, and I was able to come in as a set designer. And a set designer will work for the art directors and for the assistant art directors. And it's basically just spending a lot of time on the drawing board, or these days, a lot of time, on the computer, and you're drafting, you're building, cardboard models. You're just churning out the drawings for everyone else. And then when you start moving through sort of assistant art director roles, that means that you can start sort of, being down in the workshop and talking to the people who are building, what you're drawing. And so by the time you're art directing, you're actually in charge of a set. So when a script is given to the production designer, and the production designer will hire art directors, you usually divvy it up so that you know that each sort of section of the script will be handled by different people, so that then they can take charge of that. And then they will have a team of assistant art directors and set designers who will help see it through, if you know what I mean. And construction do the same thing, so that they will have foremen who are assigned to particular sets. And it's the only way that you can handle the volume of work. And the production designer, which is what I work, the role that I'm in now, that's the head of the art department. So that means that we're responsible for not only the look of the show, but making sure that it gets there on time and on budget. So you're basically the point person and the cheerleader of the art department, making sure that the producers and the directors and the showrunners and everybody is, understanding what the art department's delivering, making sure that, the locations are selected, that everybody's in agreement. You go to all of the meetings, there's a lot of sort of chat and and that you deliver it. You make sure that everything's working towards what those guys are all expecting. And then, when the director walks on set and they want things changed, that's the time that you've got to also sort of step in and, suggest how it can be done, or, let them know that it can't be done, or, whatever. But you're the person who's absolutely responsible right up until the point that, the set finishes shooting, for the delivery of that set, insofar as it has to function for everybody. It has to look good, but it also has to work for the camera department, has to work for the lighting department, has to work for stunts and special effects and all of everybody else. So it's sort of the art department meets almost every other department, and there's a lot of coordination involved.
That's really interesting.
It's very interesting because in a way it
intense.
sounds really familiar to the design process of a building and the different phases, the junior designer, the project managers, the GC, the subcontractors. Like it's really, in a way, kind of a similar...
I would probably describe the production designer as being very close and parallel to traditionally what the architect did. And does for certain projects, in that kind of level of oversight. That's interesting. So as a production designer, who are the people you work with who are in the kind of the chart of hierarchy, who are adjacent to you? Like, do you work directly with the director, I would assume? Yeah.
So in the television sort of world, you also have showrunners, and those are the writers. And those are the guys, who've written the script and who are ultimately responsible, I guess, for delivering the whole show. So in Game of Thrones and Three Body Problem Terms, that was David Benioff and Dan Weiss. They've written the show, they know what it's going to be, they've convinced HBO to make it, or Netflix to make it, and then they hire all of the heads of department who are then responsible for each of their departments in terms of getting the thing done. Television is slightly different because film just sort of will be the director, and then you work for that director. But in TV, it's sort of the showrunners first, then the directors and producers, and then people like me who are frantically running around trying to please them all. So that can be quite tricky. I remember when I worked on Game of Thrones, because I'd never experienced anything like it in my life, and we had 5 5 directing teams who would work at once, because we had 10 episodes and each director would do 2 episodes each. And I remember there would literally be a line of these people outside of my office, and I thought, how am I supposed to handle this?
You each get 8.5 minutes.
yeah, exactly. And it was just, and the guy who used to sit outside of my office, he was hilarious, because he said, there should have been some sort of flag system. She's free now. But yeah, you've got to keep a lot of people happy. However, that being said, the showrunners are the final word. So, if there's ever any arguments about anything, or, they want an extra window there, if the showrunner says no, then it's no. If the cinematographer comes to me and says, it's really too dark, we need to put this in here, then I have to go and, check that that's okay with everybody else. And then, off we go. But yeah, a lot of people have a lot of demands of a set, as they would if it was a real building, I guess. And it has to function on the day. So I remember in my first year, it was one of the more dramatic moments, because we were in sort of a medieval world on Game of Thrones. All of the window reveals were really wide, that really big old chunky reveals. And they were a nightmare for the cinematographers because they couldn't angle their lights in. And and I just said, well, that's too bad, because the light wouldn't get in there. Like, it just wouldn't.
Yeah, right.
And we have to deal with that. Like, it's more candles inside or whatever. And it was always a point of contention, how we would resolve, how they would light these sets with these massive reveals. The windows had to be slightly larger, whatever, to try and compensate. But yeah, I remember there was one cinematographer who took to the reveals with a chainsaw. And I was furious, obviously, but yeah, it was a tough way to learn.
Oh, goodness, that's a good thing.
So how much of those situation gets fixed on the spot as you're shooting the scenes? Like, I imagine you have girls and boys sitting on the side with tool belts and whatever craft things handy to be able to jump and fix stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, we have what's called an on-set art director or a standby art director. Yeah. And that's the person who essentially represents the production designer on set. And if there's a massive issue, they'll call and say, what do you want me to do? But mostly they're there to help facilitate all of those things. So if a wall needs to be moved, or furniture needs to be shifted around, or stuff needs to be removed entirely, or the set rejigged for whatever reason, they're the people who are on the spot, in charge of running that. And it's a lot of responsibility, actually, because sometimes when people start running behind or whatever, it can be quite fraught. And you've got to be able to stand your ground and make sure that, in the environment, it still works for the set. Yeah. So, yeah, I always come down, I'm always on the side of the creatives. And it gets me in trouble sometimes, but yeah, it's like, so long as it looks good. I don't care about anything else. Just make sure it looks good. So yeah, and yeah, I've been told that, I should keep that sort of down a bit. But
but if you look at your resume, you just tell them to screw off. Look at my resume. Look, I get results.
But the design is really important. It's like no one else will notice. They're like, yes, they will.
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of true. I mean, I think it's true for sure. I think it's also, what we do is very different because it's architecture and it's not nearly as fun sometimes. But I do think that the average person, the viewer or the client in our case, they are quite perceptive. They might not be able to voice why it's not right or why something is better than something else, but they know. Yeah, they can tell.
Absolutely. And the thing is too, you've got clients in the traditional sense, but I also think that it's the actors and it's the crew in a way who are the clients that I'm working with, and you want them to feel a particular way when they walk into a space. And if they don't, I think that as a viewer, you can feel it. Yeah. Like, you just know if somebody is invested in a show or in a space, and that, in terms of storytelling, it's really important. Yeah. And so anyway, it's not always a popular opinion, but I certainly think that it works. And it's interesting too, because early in my career, I worked with Baz Luhrmann on Moulin Rouge, and he built everything on stage. I worked with Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu, and he didn't build a thing on stage. He only will work on location because he believes you need to be able to smell a set. And I also worked on, I was an art director on the Sydney Olympic ceremonies. And so that taught me to just never be afraid of scale ever again. But if you put all of those shows together, you kind of get sort of how my training has allowed me to do what I do. And like somebody like Alejandro needing to smell a set, that was really instructive to me. And it's all of that. Like, and if you compromise too many of those design decisions, you can't get the smell anymore. It's gone.
Going back in time, when you first started working on The Matrix as a set designer, to be honest, it's hard for me to even like myself think about that time, because it's easy to forget how pivotal that movie was, and nothing like it really occurred. I mean, I'm not a cinephile, so I'm probably misspeaking here, but from my knowledge, there was nothing like that beforehand. It was like new. It was, and like you said, it was a kung fu movie, and it was a weird thing to describe. And then when it came out, it just blew everyone's minds.
It was a blip in the Matrix. Right?
So I don't know. My question is, I guess the question is like, what was it like? And when you were working on it, did anyone that you were working with have a sense of what you guys were producing and what it would be in the end?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was too young, I think, and because I'd never worked in film before, I really didn't know. But I was told that a lot of the camera stuff was, very revolutionary, because they created what they call bullet time. And I could understand that looked kind of cool. But yeah, what you sort of know as a set designer, you're not really privy to too much, and it's not like you get to sort of see anything being filmed, or you see sort of the movie being pieced together at all. So, for the tiny little part that I was playing in it, I thought it was amazing, and it was certainly enough to convince me to keep working in the industry. But I didn't have any real idea about the overarching sort of thing of what we were creating. The most exciting thing for me was we were working at Fox Studios here in Sydney, and they were also shooting Babe, Pig in the City at the same time.
I love that movie.
Don't know whether you've seen it. Any of the Babe. But I was so excited because from my little desk, my drawing board, I could look out the window and they were walking the little Babe pig around with the little tuft of hair. Yeah. And I remember thinking, this is the industry for me. Like, this is great. And I'd say to everyone, babes out. I was so excited. So I was sort of blown away, I think, by the idea of it, like the world of it. I mean, I didn't understand the complexities of it. And, having seen a few storyboards of The Matrix, that's where I got the Kung Fu line from. But yeah, I really had no idea. I was just so sort of intrigued by the whole thing, because as a set designer and in the theatre, what I'd been learning was a very sort of abstract kind of way of designing, in a sense, because you don't have to think about the whole room. You can just it's very stylized of design, I guess, and a way of interpreting text. But when you get into film, you're thinking about the whole space, and you're trying to resolve the whole space. And that was something that, from my architecture background, I felt far more comfortable doing. And yet these guys were doing it in a way, on The Matrix, that was not, real life. It was something imagined. And and I remember sort of quite looking down on my old architecture friends, thinking, ugh, you're still still doing that. Look at me, I'm doing it. It was kind of great. I really loved it. And when I was on Moulin Rouge, and then I went on to Anna and the King, and we filmed that in Malaysia. So that was my first opportunity to work overseas, which I loved. And, and then we were building Thai architecture, which clearly I had no familiarity with, certainly not in a drafting sense. And here's a great story that you'll appreciate as architects, because we were having to rebuild the Royal Palace in Bangkok. And the Thai royalty didn't want anything to do with with the show of Anna and the King. So what we had to do was send assistants out to Bangkok, and they just wore striped shirts, with quite wide stripes on them. And then they would stand next to these architectural details wearing their striped shirts. And we knew we knew exactly how wide the stripes were.
That's how you survey a monument.
Yeah. That's how we surveyed the monument without ever putting, a tape next to any of them. We just had hundreds of photographs of these guys standing in front of stuff. And that's how we drafted. And isn't that brilliant?
That's
I've never forgotten
smart.
that. And we worked with a fantastic Thai art director, and he was brilliant. And so there were a lot of Thai guys, Thai sculptors, all that. So I just thought that was, to be able to work inside somebody else's culture, that's such a privilege. Yeah. And and I came back to Australia, and then I was on Moulin Rouge, and I built the big elephant that's in the garden of the Moulin Rouge in that movie. So that was where I suddenly thought, maybe I could actually have a good go at this. Maybe this is where I need to be. So it took a while. And then after that, I was onto the Olympics and sort of seeing, different ways that, design, having an interest in design, all of the ways that it can be interpreted into, actual jobs and, what you can do with it.
Yeah.
So I had a good run for a while.
Was there a particular point when you realized that what you do currently, which is being the projection designer, was the role that you wanted to be in, as opposed to just staying as a set designer and producing illustrations, or as opposed to being something else where you're kind of, because some people, I find also in architecture, they don't want to be at the top, let's say. They want to just be drawing. They don't want to, or they just want to do construction details,
Yep. Yeah, and God bless those people, because that's not me. Yeah. I really enjoy talking about detail, but I don't want to do it all day long. I think it was about Moulin Rouge where I actually realised that I had something to offer. And the wonderful thing about Baz Luhrmann and his wife, Catherine Martin, who's the production designer whom he works with, is they both had my education. So they had come from the National Institute of Dramatic Art as well, and they were working in film. And it was so interesting because I was there, working on this elephant, sculpting this little elephant, and Baz actually came along and he said, "You're NIDA, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "I can tell." And it was just that sort of understanding of, he used to call it real artificiality, whereby the film is trying to be real, but in an artificial way. And I remember thinking, God, this is cool. I understood exactly what he meant by it. And so I was able to use my architectural education, but sort of put a spin on what I'd learned when I was in theatre school. And that's where I thought, okay, right, there's something unique that I offer. And there's a lot of people, obviously, in the film industry, like the majority of people clearly have come from film school. But yeah, I'm not a cinephile. That's sort of not me. I really enjoy watching documentaries far more than I enjoy watching film. But yeah, I mean, for me, architecture has been the key to all of it. And I think that's sort of what I offer. So I'm really, really, really grateful for that.
As I'm listening to you speak, I think I missed my...
I was expecting him to say that at some point.
Because I do joke...
He's going to quit his job at the end of this interview.
Every so often that I think that if I wasn't practicing architecture, people ask, if you weren't doing what you're doing now, like, what would you do? And aside from being like an astronaut or something, I've always felt that something in the movie or TV, the fictional space like that would be, I know for myself would be very interesting for me, but in another alternate life, that probably would have been the path.
But sometimes you practice architecture in a very fictional way.
Yeah. So. And I tell other people to figure it out.
And I have to be, making it real.
But it's I can completely imagine, because there's in another life. I really, really enjoy architecture, and that's my reason for traveling anywhere or whatever. Like, I just want to go and look at buildings, and I'm more obsessed by it now than I was. Like, I was just too young, I think, to study architecture. I always wish I could go back and do it again in a way.
Oh, interesting.
I really respect it. And for anybody who says they're an architect, I really bow down to you, because I really, really appreciate it as a really rigorous profession. And I don't think it gets the kind of respect that it should. And So for me, it's sort of extraordinary to be able to use what I learned, in the little 3 years that I did it, and be able to spin it into something else that people recognise has been kind of great. And I get people writing to me all the time saying, I'm studying architecture because, I heard that that's what you did. And I thought, oh my God, don't study it because of me. It's more difficult than that. Like, architecture is really difficult, So, I'm glad I've been some sort of a mouthpiece for the value of architecture. But yeah, it's tough.
Well, I'm
really
glad
tough.
as well, too. But I will also say that I can guarantee that there's going to be a lot of people listening to this, and now their horizons are going to be wider, and their doors are going to be much more to other different things. I mean, the number of friends we have who studied architecture and do different things is quite high, which is both a great thing and also sometimes a little bit troubling for the profession. But it's and with what you do now, it makes sense if you think about the skill sets. But I think a lot of people listening are going to feel like this is production design or something in film could be good.
But like, architecture is one of the noble professions. I will go out on the stump for architecture any day of the week. I sort of, like, I'm doing this because I'm a failed architect. You know what I mean? Like, I wish I had have finished it. So, and that's the thing. When I went off and studied stage design, I certainly know my parents, and even I sort of expected that I would come back and finish it off. Well, none of us could have predicted what would have happened. So, it's a far more fragile existence, I think, as a working in the film industry. But look, I mean, the industry needs more architects as far as I'm concerned. So like, come on over.
We'll send some over.
Yeah. I as I say, I would always hire people who have an understanding of architecture, because it's really tough, when you're talking to people who, haven't got that sort of discipline, because architecture is a discipline. They teach you how to see. Like, architecture teaches you to see. And if you're not used to looking at scale in that way, if you're not used to talking about space in that way, I just think the profession would be really difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. I never really thought about it that way, but there's a lot of those fundamentals you do learn in architecture school, and then the other aspect of being able to talk about it is a completely different thing too. Because I know people who are naturally talented and gifted in understanding certain aspects, but if you can't draw it or convey it to someone else, it doesn't amount to anything. And it's a tough thing to learn on your own.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's important to be told that your plan looks like you dropped a pizza on it, because you've got to get good at communicating it. And if it looks confused. And the great thing was, I went back to my old architecture school a few years back, and that lecturer has since died, but there's a big portrait of him, hanging in the stairwell. And I said, oh, there's Max. And they went, yeah, did you know Max? Was he teaching here when you were here? And I'm like, was he teaching here? Absolutely. He taught me one of the, and the great thing was that he was aware of, I know he was aware of what I went on to do. So
that's awesome.
So that was really great. Yeah. But actually, it started with him,
Yeah, from the pizza comment. That's funny.
Yeah, the pizza comment. Yeah.
Is the path from set designer to becoming production designer? It sounds like that's quite a huge progression to make. Is how you got to being production designer like a common or typical path? I just feel like it would be really difficult if I were a set designer and I had aspirations to become a production designer on a show like Game of Thrones or something. Okay, maybe not that level, but something near that stratosphere. Like, I feel like that would be a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, look, I was very fortunate, because when I worked on Moulin Rouge, the set designer, I beg your pardon, the set decorator, her name was Bridget Brock, and she was extraordinary in her own right. And she had worked with Catherine and Baz on Romeo and Juliet when it shot in Mexico, so she knew them from there. And she was a production designer in her own right in Mexico City. And she was an amazing German woman who'd relocated and moved there. And so she said the magic words to me. She said, I will mentor you, which is phenomenal. And, I have I've been really, really fortunate to meet lots of 1 in a million people and throughout my career, and she certainly was one of them. And so I went to Mexico City and worked with her for a while. And little did I know at the time, she was working with Alejandro. So they had made Amores Perros together. And without Alejandro, I would never have been able to make the step into the United States. I was 29 and I art directed 21 grams for He and Bridget. So, that's amazing. I had my first US visa working on a short pen film, So it was kind of amazing. Like these people, these really extraordinary people gave me an opportunity. And it's not like the path is really clearly designated.
Right.
And I think in lots of ways I benefited because I came from Australia where there just wasn't the history and the rigor that maybe had I have grown up in the UK or in the US, where there's, you guys have the unions and, it's quite tough to make it through the system there. And certainly in the UK, you make it through the system through very defined steps on a ladder. But in Australia, I was an art director on the Sydney Olympic Games and I was 27. How do you get to do that? Yeah. So it was through the sort of cowboy kind of nature that, I had developed through being here and through that sort of obscene, that outrageous kind of, I was about to say obscene competitiveness that I had where I was like, yeah, I'll do that. Sure, I can try. And so by the time I went to Mexico and was with Bridget and Alejandro, I was kind of ready to try art directing. And because Bridget had always said that she would mentor me and Alejandro knew me from Mexico, it's really an amazing thing. So that's what I did. And I never really thought too much about it. I was pretty young to be doing it. And so, the path to production design sort of opened up through Bridget, really. And she really made sure that I was equipped with all that I needed by the time the opportunity came to do it.
That's very interesting. And we have to ask also, and I know you've been asked this before, how did Game of Thrones come around? Like, do you just get a phone call one day from the showrunners and they say, hey...
what are you doing for the next 15 years of your life?
Yeah, 15 years.
No, you're a struggling Australian in Los Angeles who needs a job. What do you think? No, well, it's a long story. So I left Australia in about 2007, 2008 to go and live in LA because to me it just seemed, and I was right, my instinct about it was correct, that the work that comes to Australia has come from the United States. And so I thought the way that I need to head off the system and be considered for a production designer is actually to go where the work comes from. And Bridget, again, sort of helped me with that. She helped me get an agent and sort of set myself up there so that, I had a means of navigating the system. And
you need an agent if you're acting as a... how do you put it? Like a non-talent person? I thought agents were just for the talent.
No, cinematographers, production designers, directors, we all have agents.
Gotcha.
So, it's big business.
Yeah. Okay.
So, so Bridget set me up with my first agent over there. And then I kind of sat in LA for 5 years. It was really tough. Because, I had no experience production designing. I'd art directed some kind of cool stuff. I'd worked on some cool stuff, but and it was always like I was given opportunities, but they never really happened. I sort of started, location hunting on a film, and then it was suddenly like, there were three financial backers, two approved of me, one didn't. So then I was fired, and then, and then an actor would drop out of something else and the whole thing would collapse. Or Joel Schumacher, fantastic guy. He hired me on one of his movies, and then the whole thing fell over. So again, it was like, but Joel was really lovely, and he said, "Don't worry, you're going to make it here one day." So that was really sweet. And then I just was working on a really terrible ghost busting film in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge of all places, and I was earning $100 a day, I think. And
wow.
So I was on this little tiny little film, and the important thing was that when I had first moved to LA many years earlier, like those 5 years earlier, my agent at the time had sent me around to meet all of the heads of the studio. So it was kind of like whenever I looked at Project Runway, I always thought it was hilarious. I kind of understood what they were doing, you know, when they would go out on their go-sees. Mm-hmm. It was like that, you know, me with my little portfolio sort of driving madly across Los Angeles trying to introduce myself to people. And, you know, you've got 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever, you know, to tell them what you can do and to sort of show them your stuff. So I had met Janet Graham Barber at HBO during that time. So I met her in 2008. And while I was working on that film in Baton Rouge in 2013, Janet called back. So it was a long wait in between.
But worth it.
Yeah. And I mean, how extraordinary. So she had said, there's a project that I think that you should interview for. So then it was another kind of month of quite intensive interviews. And I remember saying to David and Dan, you know, the two showrunners, saying, look, you know, I've never worked in television before. And they were like, don't worry, this isn't television. And the thing was, I was an Australian living in the United States, but the show was shooting in Ireland. And I sort of realized now too that I was a good mix, because the Americans understood that I understood them, but I had much more of an English kind of sensibility, I guess, or, you know, Irish sensibility. I mean, my surname's, you know, Riley, for heaven's sake. Right. So, you know, I was accepted within that art department there relatively quickly. Huh. And the point was, the guys had already made 3 seasons of Game of Thrones. So for them, it was important that they were replacing the conductor, but not the whole orchestra. Right. So they needed somebody who could just slot in with all of the loyalty and all of those incredibly talented artists that they were already working with. You know, the last thing they needed was somebody who was going to upend everything. So I was like, great, I'll do that. And you can imagine how terrifying it was for me. But, again, I didn't.
Did you watch the show, like the previous seasons?
3 seasons?
Before? Like, did you know what you were getting into?
Oh, no idea. But the great thing was that they sent me all of the previous 3 seasons, the last season of which hadn't been released yet. And so I had a weekend to watch 30 hours of television. So I was just sort of holding my eyes open.
Oh, wow.
And then I met with them. So, yeah, it was kind of great. But I understood what they were doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the interview, I think the key thing was I understood that the dragons just needed to be treated as dogs.
Yeah.
I understood that it was like, in order to believe in dragons, the environment had to be very real. Huh. Yes, it was medieval and yes, it was fantasy, but an audience had to actually believe it. And then you would believe in dragons. And, you know, I don't know whether you remember images of the original Hong Kong airport, you know, where people would be ironing and, you know, and somebody in a plane sort of coming into land could, you know, look through the window and see them sort of standing there. So it was that kind of thing, that it would be as familiar, that a dragon would be as familiar to people living in Westeros as, you know, somebody, you know, standing there doing their ironing with a big jumbo coming into land outside their window. You know, so it was that kind of, you know, real world reference that the guys understood, that I knew what they were trying to achieve. So I think that was something to do with it. And I also was I spent a couple of years really concerned that I was, you know, very much suffering from that whole sort of intruder kind of thing where I thought, you know, why me? And and I remember saying, you know, well, why was it me? You know, it could have been anybody. And they were really, really gorgeous and said, look, HBO gave them a chance. And then they played it forward with me. So,
that's cool.
Yeah, how lucky was I? Yeah. And, you know, they're the loveliest people in the world.
So how far in advance are you officially hired before work starts? Like, how much preparation time is there before? I don't know how these schedules work, but you must need like a fair amount of time to understand. I mean, there's also a massive show. Like, I don't mean in success, but I mean like production wise, like massive.
Yeah, so I would usually be hired about 5 months before, you know, shooting would begin.
Wow.
So, so 5 months, yeah. So it was at least 15 weeks. And then as the show got bigger, it was, sort of a little bit more. And yeah, depending on the complexity of what you're doing, sort of depends on, how much time you've got. But yeah, I mean, to go back to a Wallace and Gromit reference again, it is that thing of just like trying really quickly to lay the track as as the train's coming along. So you've really got to use the prep time.
I was going to say, 5 months. 5 months might sound like a long time to some folks, but I'm also thinking it might not be that much time. I would assume those 5 months go by super quickly. Like you're not taking. Yeah. It's not a leisurely 5 months.
No, not at all. And they get more and more nerve-wracking as the weeks go by. It sort of starts out quite relaxed, going, oh, yeah, we've got all the time in the world. But yeah, it's never that way. Because, there's a lot of location scouting that has to happen, so you do a lot of, driving around and looking at stuff and trying to figure out, what can work, what can't, what's going to be a build, what's going to be on location. And trying to sort of figure out, because it's also a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. You've only got so much stage space. Mm. They only have so many days to shoot. What's the game of Tetris? To what you build here while you're building that, and then this gets knocked down, and then you'll build something else. Like in terms of scheduling and everything, it's really very complicated. And the production designer and the construction manager and and the producers have to work really hard in order to figure out just what the order of the builds should be. And the important thing too is, built into that schedule, you also have to give the art department time, because you have to give time to build stuff. It's like, okay, well, we've done that major build, but then this is coming up, so that needs a certain window as well. So you have to, as the production designer, you also have to be quite protective of the art department and make sure that you actually have the kind of resources available to build what needs to be built in the time available. And it's in those early days of planning, it's really important that you've protected yourself enough to make sure that you can, achieve, what's needed in the time that they have and for the money that they have. And so those days of prep are a very creative time, but in terms of planning, they're also a very strategic time.
It's incredible. It really is. I'm also curious, so how much larger was the production effort on Game of Thrones compared to your second largest project you had worked on before Game? I'm assuming Game of Thrones was the largest one when you started in your work history up to that point.
Well, so I think it was bigger than anything at the time. And the extraordinary thing was, like we would work with up to 3 shooting crews at once, because the number of shoot days we had was so enormous. Like we got up to like 250 shoot days, which is a huge amount. So the only way we could get it done in the time available was just to keep, add another shooting crew to make sure that we would get the work done. So in that sense, I don't think anybody had shot like that before to that scale. So it was really incredible. And we were shooting over, different countries as well. Like we were based out of Belfast, but we might have been shooting in Iceland or Croatia or Spain at the same time. And, there was another unit off, shooting, pickup shots somewhere else. We were really spreading ourselves very, very thin. But the wonderful thing that Game of Thrones taught me was, just about loyalty. And by working with the same people year in, year out, we all knew each other so well, and we knew the show so well that it was a very easy thing to split up like that, and knew that we all had everything covered. I don't think you could work at that capacity with people you've just met. But we certainly, we were like such a well-oiled machine. It was really amazing. And, when the show finished, that was the hardest part, was, leaving all of those incredible people and knowing that, that machine, it would be very, very rare for us to ever find that again.
Yeah.
They should have just kept going with the show. I feel like there's a lot more that could happen.
Yeah, well, I think I was quite sick of medieval barrels by that point. But yeah, I would give anything to work with the construction manager out there again, Tom Martin. He was absolutely unbelievable. And his crew and, the art directors that I had there, they were just absolutely, absolutely fantastic. And none of us could have done it without each other. That's the thing. And about 3 years before we finished, we sat down as a group and said, are we going to finish this thing? Like, what's everybody feeling about it? And and we decided that we would see the show through. And I think had one of us said, look, I've had enough, I'm out, I think that would have been it. We probably would have all gone our separate ways, but we decided to see it through together. And Halka, one of the art directors, he said, well, it didn't hurt the Potters. And I thought, you know what? He's right. Harry Potter did just fine, so we'll do the same thing.
It didn't hurt the Potters.
Yeah, it didn't hurt the Potters. And it was true, and it was with that one line, it didn't hurt the Potters. And I thought, he's right. We'll just keep going. And so we did. And I'm so glad we did. It was an amazing thing.
That's really awesome.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, like for us architects, right, when we're working on a project, it goes from like concept to 3D model to plans to construction site, and we have the overall vision, in our heads or in the computer as a rendering, right? And we're just kind of like working toward that. Like the vision is defined, we're just trying to really make it real. And we see it in bits and pieces and in wearing different types of glasses, looking at it before it gets done. But I was wondering, how does that work for you guys? Because it seems like a lot of it is very loose in the process. It's not like a well-defined beginning, right? So how do you manage making sure that the final, let's say, outcome comes out to be cohesive, coherent, feels like it's one, movie or episode, and it makes sense when it's so scattered and chopped into so many pieces.
And filmed out of order, too.
Yeah.
And it's really tricky, but I think that's the role of the production designer, is to just make sure that everything, that we're actually all knitting together, the same jumper, that it's all one thing, because it would be really easy to have it just completely discombobulated with people working off, on their own track. But on Game of Thrones, for example, we had a lookbook, and that was really the Bible of the whole show. We understood that this kind of temperature in this place equaled these kind of colours and, this kind of texture and all that sort of stuff. So we had a really good understanding of the colours and textures of everywhere. And then I was flying around the place like a mad thing. Excuse me. And I remember once going down to Spain, and they had a particular door knocker on it, and I just said, you can't use that one, we use that in the bread keep. That's preserved for somewhere else. And obviously the team there, because they didn't work in Belfast, had no idea. So it comes down sort of to somebody like me who sees everything to be able to say, that doesn't quite work. But the art directors and I would always have a really good understanding of where a place is and what that would mean for the people who live there, and work from there. So every location had its own sort of design style and tone that we were trying to set. So that helped. And where there's all the 3D modeling and all that sort of stuff that you guys would be used to, but we also do concept art, and so that would take a particular moment from the script and we would illustrate that. And so by the end of the season, my office would just be full of concept art. And so it would almost be like storyboards in a way, but focusing on the art, focusing on the set design and the props of those particular scenes. And then you can kind of start seeing a thread as you run through. So there's a way of kind of hooking all of that together. But the cinematographers also have a very similar problem, because there were, on Game of Thrones, there were 5 different cinematographers, so they have to be very, very careful to make sure that they're all using very similar camera techniques. The one's not doing sort of wild overhead shots or zooming around when another sort of keeps their camera very static. So there were certain rules that we all understood with the way that we were working. And so no matter who was stepping in, there was an understanding of what we were trying to achieve. And I think that's remarkable when you consider how big it was. But we were all pretty well schooled in what it should look like and what it should feel like. And from a cinematographer's point of view, they knew their stuff as well. The painters, the plasterers, the painters, the people in my departments, they all understood, what they were doing too. So, everybody in whatever role they played in it, they all knew the world in which we were living. And it was easier than it sounds, but it was still very difficult.
Sure. That's pretty amazing. I mean, sometimes it takes us to look for like a lot of different contractors just to get the right detail done, because they're just not getting it. So the fact that so many people on, let's say, a movie or a show could get what something that's not defined is just incredible to me.
Well, yeah, and I was so lucky on Game of Thrones because the construction manager, Tom Martin, has a brilliant eye, and it all comes down to your eye, really. Mm-hmm. And I remember there was a point on a set for it was called the Hall of Faces in the House of Black and White. That was about season 5, and I was out in Spain at the time, and they were building the set back in Belfast. And Tom gave me a call, and he just said, "Debbie, there's something that's happening here that I'm not sure you'd agree with. Can I just ask them to stop until you get back?" And I said, "Sure." Yeah. And so, the great thing was there were always eyes on it. And somebody like Tom had such a strong eye, so he knew if something was not looking quite right. Yep. And so, I was so lucky because, there were people who had my back.
That's really cool.
Was there a favorite part of the production design, whether it be a full set, a part of a set, or something else that stands out to you as being a favorite from the Game of Thrones?
Yeah, I mean, there was in season 4, we built the Marine audience chamber, which was sort of supposed to be inside the Great Pyramid of Marine, where Daenerys sort of ends up. And that meant a lot to me because that was the first big significant build with me being there. And you can imagine the pressure, it was just extraordinary. And when that set finally stood and it hummed, like it was one of those spaces that you walked into and the scale was, we were lucky in those studios because they were sort of 70 feet high or something. So, there was room for us to give it genuine height, might have been 35 feet, but, there was, we were able to create a big volume. We were able to, the plasterers were so talented, they made those plaster sheets look like big, ancient stone. And, it was really amazing. And I just remember there being this collective sigh of relief when everybody saw it. Like, oh, okay, she's going to be fine. And it was a really beautiful space when you stood in it, but also it photographed beautifully. And I kind of think that if you stand in a space and it feels right, I also have come to understand that it also will photograph well. Mm-hmm. So, it photographed beautifully. And then sort of, I think it was about season 7 maybe, we built the Dragonstone audience chamber, which was quite different. And that was sort of a whole different architectural language and something that felt reasonably original. So I enjoyed that for entirely different reasons. But it's something that is... that original Marine audience chamber, I went and said a special little goodbye to it before it was brought down. Yeah. And I was very grateful for all of the goodwill that it brought me. And I went and gave it a little pat and said goodbye.
Oh, that's nice.
Did you keep a piece of some
say.
sort?
No, it's really funny actually because a lot of people do souvenir stuff, and no, I'm not one of those people.
You don't have a necklace with a piece of that plaster in it, capture, capsule.
I remember on Moulin Rouge that the elephant had a heart in the center of it. There was a balcony thing, I guess, and there was a heart and I was offered the heart that sort of hung across it. And I remembered thinking, it's just a piece of polystyrene. I don't need it. And I sort of slightly regretted that in years. I sort of thought, God, I could have, on eBay, that really would have But at the end of Game of Thrones, all I asked for was a little dragon skull. So I have a little, it's about the size of a cat skull, I guess.
Yeah, cute.
Yeah, it's a little dragon skull. So that's my souvenir from that show.
That's cool.
It's really lovely, and it's like a funny little archaeological piece. But it's great. It's really cool.
That's really cool. I was wondering, like, how much of the sets are still being built with all of the CGI that's available now? Like, and also, like, how tricky is it to work in sets that are hybrids of both? Like, how could you really picture what things are going to be like, or things are going to work when half of it is built and the other one is like digital?
Yeah, and this is becoming more and more of an issue. But the way Game of Thrones worked was that really they needed as much visual effects money as they possibly could for dragons. And, so there would sort of be one establishing shot that would maybe have a bit of set extension on it. And then the rest, you'd come into sort of being sort of mid-shots pretty quickly. But one thing, this is with sort of the technology, you can sort of build sets now in virtual reality too. Yeah. So the wonderful thing is you can go inside those sets and sort of check them out and build them all, in 3D, and then, send it up the pipeline to visual effects to complete in post-production. But the art department have built in all of the details. So it's really great. All of that design work stays within the art department where it belongs. And then, visual effects can get on with building things like dragons, So it was actually a very clear process. And we would still build sets sort of 33, 35 feet high, wow. Those bigger ones. So it's still a lot of construction.
Yeah.
And, it's surprising, actually. There's on the better shows still tend to build a lot more.
Yeah.
And that's really heartening, because I think as a viewer, you can kind of tell when it's digital, like we're sort of living in a time where it's getting better and better, but as a viewer, you can tell and you can feel if something's phony. I think just like you can feel a phony performance, you can feel a phony environment.
I was going to ask you about the, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the big curved screen that's used as a backdrop, and they use it on a number of films, TV shows as well. But the one that comes in, the volume, that's it. Yeah, and it's used on, I think, The Mandalorian and a few other Star Wars things.
Yeah, The Mandalorian did it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just curious, like, what your thoughts are on that, because it's got to be. I mean, one, it's amazing, but it's also very, very strange that now there's just a screen behind the actors.
Yeah, it was really effective. I went and saw part of The Mandalorian being shot actually on that screen, and yeah, I mean, it is amazing what they can achieve, but it also has lots of limitations too. You can't do a big crowd scene in there because obviously the screen is only sort of so big. There's it also really front loads the work, so all of those design, cinematography, lighting decisions are made, in my opinion, so early that they really lock you into a certain way of thinking, which may have developed if it had time to, before all of those digital processes really needed to start.
Explain that part. How using a technology like that would cause some of the design decisions to be front loaded. What does that mean?
Yeah, so imagine all of the design decisions that have needed to be made by the time that screen is built, and by the time you've got, all of those environments up on the screen. All of the camera moves, my understanding of it anyway, perhaps it's evolved further, but my understanding of it is that, the camera moves need to be all
pre-programmed,
already programmed in because of the parallax errors of the blips of the screen.
Yeah.
And so, you're making very big statements about what you're shooting and how you're shooting it very early. And I'm used to being in an environment where it's a little bit more, flying by the seat of your pants. And, seeing on the day how actors move, seeing on the day, what the weather's giving you or whatever, and responding accordingly. Whereas in those environments, my understanding anyway, I haven't worked in them myself, is that you're locking in in a way that, when you're shooting on a built set, you would never have to do.
I see. That makes sense now.
It just kind of sounds like they're using BIM, like the complicated 3D, 2D software for architects. Like it's the same thing. If we start designing in those complex software, you already have to pick the style of windows that you want to use before you even have designed the building. So it's kind of a little bit like 3 steps ahead of where we're at, and that's I think also where the magic just gets lost and opportunities for magical accident to happen.
Serendipity.
Yeah, and I think too, by what I understand, and again, I haven't worked in it myself, so I can't be entirely sure, but my understanding is that it doesn't end up being cheaper. And that was sort of the idea, is that it would, save all of this money, and, you wouldn't have to go all the way to Tunisia because you could bring Tunisia inside the studio, whatever. Like it certainly has certain advantages, but budgets isn't necessarily one of them. So, it's very exciting technology. And I remember spending some time with Lucasfilm, and Kathleen Kennedy was there, talking about this great sort of invention. And she said, she hadn't been so excited, since she first saw dinosaurs run across the screen. And I understand what she means. It is a substantial leap forward in technology and what can be achieved. It's just a matter of us still figuring out where it's applicable. Like it doesn't work with everything, but it can enhance sort of certain scenes. So it'll be interesting to see how it continues to grow.
Is budget part of something that as a production designer or director you have to be involved in, or is there someone that's outside of your role that's taking care of all of that? Like, how does that work?
No, I get hauled over the coals constantly for budget stuff. And I had a really embarrassing moment actually on Three Body Problem where we'd designed and built and had concepts or whatever, designed and built. We'd built a card model, and there were all these concepts for this set that we intended to build, blah blah blah. And our producer just thought it was too expensive, and she was just like, "That doorway, how much does that doorway cost?" And it was like, that doorway's $10,000 or something. Gone. Right. How tall is it? And it's like, it's 35 feet. Right. How much is it if we bring it down to 28? Right. Done. And I was just like, and I was standing in front of it. It was one of those sort of, pizza on your plan kind of moments where I was standing in front of a whole group of people as what I had been working on was just torn to shreds.
Yeah.
And I mean, she was right. And look, what you see on screen, nobody would know that, we intend to have a doorway there, and nobody would know that the set was meant to be full or whatever. Yeah, she was right, absolutely. But absolutely. Like the budget and the time that it takes to build it or whatever, it all becomes my problem if it starts going wrong.
If it starts going
it's all
wrong,
going right, nobody cares.
If the show is a success,
That's usually how it works.
And it's just so funny, And I remember, on Game of Thrones, like, no set, even the worst sort of, the tiniest set would still be £18,000. Like that was a tiny set.
Yeah.
And and then there'd be sort of £500,000 on something else. So, you cover the whole range of things to be accountable for. But sometimes it can be tough when things aren't going well. Suddenly the glare of the budgeting process comes squarely down upon me. It's like, wow, what do you want? And I often say, well, okay, if you don't want the door, we won't build the door. That's fine. Fine. So it's up to you. Fine. But it'll look better if the door's there. The audience only know what you show them.
Yeah, well, that's true.
We're watching the show, so you have to let us know where that doorway was.
We haven't been able. We were trying to finish it before the interview, but we have, I think, two
more episodes.
One or two episodes left.
Yeah.
And it's
it was in the game inside the Chinese pyramid. Where they do the I Ching.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So it was. I had a much more grand intention for that space. I was never realised.
I'm going to go back and rewatch that.
We're going to look at it.
I mean, it just ends up being a really blank canvas, which is completely fine. Like she was absolutely right.
We'll leave a review on the about the show and being like,
5 stars, really but I think that door. I feel like a door was missing.
What we really needed was another doorway. But And that's the thing, like it is a laundry list, you know, of what the director needs. And each of those items comes with a price tag. And then if I'm adding anything else to that that's not specifically on that list, then, you know, it's on the chopping block. And I have to stand accountable. So sometimes you win some, you lose some.
What is it like to work on different types of shows too? Because it's not, the stories are different. The design direction is potentially very, very different from like Westeros to a lot of the kind of, I mean, there's a mixture of stuff in the Three Body Problem, but you know, Three Body Problem is different. And also the crew is different. The director is different perhaps. And I mean, the showrunners are the same in this case, but so I mean, is it difficult to work from one thing to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great pleasures of being in production design, actually, and that's being able to, you know, cherry pick through, and maybe this is something that you guys would really enjoy as well, you know, cherry picking through all sorts of different cultures and time periods and influences. I think that's great fun. You know, I really, really enjoy the research process. And like, you know, absolutely, you know, being able to just study that Thai architecture like I was able to do when I was on Anna and the King, you know, was phenomenal. Like, when else would you be able to do that? And I can still name the pieces of Thai architecture that otherwise I would never have been exposed to. So, you know, there's stuff like that, or I don't know, like, you know, working in the South, you know, on 21 grams, like you couldn't get more different. But the wonderful thing is that all of those design principles that you learn in architecture are applicable all the way through. You know, you're still answering all of the same questions, no matter what time period, no matter what culture, no matter what place. So I think the fundamentals remain the same, and that's always heartening. But working with different teams of people, that's quite tough. And all you can do, or all I know how to do, is lead by example. So if I find kind of quite like-minded people, it's relatively easy. But when you're working with people who, you know, maybe don't know you or know the style, or I'm pretty easygoing for the most part. It can take a bit, but actually, you know, and as a person, I'm really little, so I think people kind of underestimate me a little bit.
You mean like physically little?
Physically, I'm tiny.
Oh,
and you know, you're working with a lot of men, so I think it's very easy to have been, maybe not as much anymore, but certainly, you know, people can be very dismissive of you into those environments. So again, to have a training in that architectural language and an understanding of the jobs of all of these people, you know, really helped me, because it doesn't matter where you're working. You know, the laws of physics remain the same, and you know, how you build a set or how something stands up or whatever is the same pretty much no matter where you go. So that has always put me in good stead. And I really enjoy working with artists. I really enjoy being part of the process in terms of, you know, steering the ship so that we're all kind of trying to build a thing together, you know, that we're all part of a team. And I think that's the main thing. I'm not very good at being self-motivated, and, you know, I need to be part of a team. And so COVID for me was terrible, because it's like, well, where's the rest of my team, you know? And, you know, the time that I've been back in Australia here during the strikes, it's like, I just want a team. And that to me is great, you know, because, you know, you all the boats rise together. I'm a firm believer in that. So when I'm in that environment, that's when I feel like I'm really at my best. And that's working with other people who are, you know, interested in creating something original. And I think that's a great place to be. But it's hard won. It doesn't happen straight away.
Yeah, that's great. I was wondering if there's a I was gonna say project. I guess project, a film, movie, or TV show, or something that you haven't done yet that you'd like to. And I don't know if that means a style of film or a type or anything, but is there something that you'd like to try and do, but you haven't done yet?
Yeah,
look, you know, I think all of us designers would love to work with Wes Anderson at some point.
That's not a bad pick, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'd be extraordinary. Yeah, like I'd also just love to do a kids piece, something, And the other thing too, when you work on television, as I've done, like quite high-end TV, it's quite difficult, like 10 episodes is like equals 10 hours of entertainment, and that's a lot. I kind of I'm so impressed with people who do it because it's so hard to do. And in order to just work on a film where you have one director and you're doing maybe 2.5, 3 hours of entertainment, like that to me would just be a breeze. Like, that'd be great. So yeah, I'd love to go back into the film industry and sort of work in film. That'd be amazing. And my agent tells me that while I've got the energy to do these big TV projects, I should stick with that.
While you have the energy.
But while I've still got the energy, but I still think, oh my God, like, do you really have to, die for your art like this? Because it's tough, it's really unrelenting. Like when you do, like, as I say, like 250 shoot days, that's tough. Like that's a lot of track that you've had to lay. So
is that is that basically, call it close to, or 2/3 of a year or whatever amount of time that is? Is it 7 days a week for that period of time?
Well, it'll be sort of 5-6 days a week. Like they try and avoid 6 days if they possibly can. But that's when they start adding shoot crews, is when they realize that it's too much work for one. So it's like, oh, we'll just put another shoot crew on, which then means that, of course, instead of having, one set to shoot a day, you need 2 sets, so it actually doubles the work of the art department. But for some reason, so long as the shooting crew are fine, that's all anybody cares about.
Right.
And so, it doesn't matter how much work is put out. And it's the same, with even building the sets, like it's all very, like we're so up to our neck in mud and out in the rain and the cold and everything else, like as we're building a set. But the minute that the shooting crew comes along, all of the ground gets, cleared of the mud and everything's laid, and there's tents and there's coffee, and there's
I think of the red carpet.
Yeah, exactly. There's a tent when somebody's feeding you. Like it's amazing when the shooting crew turns up. But on Three Body Problem, I worked with a most fantastic Chinese art director named Chapman Khan. And Chapman went rogue when he was out in the forests building. We had the logging camp and the logging site, and Chapman just he went completely rogue. It was hilarious to see. And he's a trained architect, but Chapman was just hooning around these forests in his car, and he was like covered in mud, absolutely loving it. But to catch up with him was always hilarious because he was in the middle of it. And the minute the shooting crew turn up, it's a walk in the park.
That's really cool.
But that's also part of the fun, I guess.
Yeah. I was wondering, do production designers, let's say, have a style? Like designers, some architects, they kind of have their signature style, and that's just kind of like that's their shtick, that's what they do, and some others just do all kinds. Is that something that is also in your profession? And in a way, does it make sense if you're trying to achieve a certain vision in the end that maybe someone else was created? Or
well, we get typecast just like actors do.
Okay.
I can't tell you the amount of medieval shows that I was offered after Game of Thrones.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it's like anything with horses, and I'm like, no horses, no more horses. And it's the same thing. But there's no way anybody would give me a kitchen sink drama. Because they wouldn't trust me in terms of the budget, because I'm just used to working on high-end shows.
Right.
You'd need too much money, you'd need too much time.
Right.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
So there's that. It's the similar thing. So in a way, what my agent says is true insofar as you need to keep doing what you're doing. Also, because nobody else knows that you can do anything else. So just keep going. And I think. Some designers have been lucky in terms of, working with directors to do different things. And that was one of the main reasons that I really wanted to do Three Body Problem, because it has such a range of design problems within it to solve. Yeah. So that to me was a really good opportunity to do a bit of design gymnastics, which I hadn't had the opportunity to do before. So trying to convince people that you can do something that have proof of at that point, and invest all of the money and the resources to allow you to, experiment and do that. It can be tough. And I think, for a lot of designers, it can, lead down roads of, always doing police dramas.
Yeah.
And, thank God I haven't gone there. But, that's what happens, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's the same for architects. If you haven't designed and built one library, when no one is ever going to give you a library, it's kind of like this impossible problem to solve, right? But in a way, I think it also kind of like, makes a natural selections of, the clients that would hire those architects, because the ones who believe that a person who's never done that but has done an amazing project in another category, could do it, then those are the clients that you want to work with.
True.
So in a way, it's less opportunity, but the opportunities are better, I think.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of it that way. I just sort of cursed people in the first. But no, that's actually really true, because it's the people who, the people who invest in you like that are the people that you want to work with anyway. So it's a good point.
It's a way to stay positive, but
yeah, I admire you guys. Yeah, I need to talk to you more often. Yeah.
Anytime.
Well, Deborah, we blew past, just past the hour and a half, and this went very quickly, as I kind of imagined it would.
Yeah.
If you have time, I have one last question, which we usually ask, because we have a lot of architects on the show. We ask them what's their favorite building, but since you're a production designer, I guess the question.
Can I answer the favorite building?
Okay, we can do that.
I live in Sydney, and last year the Sydney Opera House celebrated its 50th birthday. And so I was lucky enough to attend all of these amazing forums about the building of that building.
Oh.
And it is unbelievable. And I'm so proud to have it in my city. And if you haven't seen it, you need to go and have a good look at it, because it is astounding. And did you know that it was actually declared a World Heritage Site when Jan Utzon was still alive?
Oh, really?
It was the first building. Yep.
Wow.
And I mean, obviously it was as you may or may not know, was very controversial, and Utzon left before the building was complete, and he never returned, which is sort of tragic to think of. However, it's like that building for Australia is our cathedral. It will stand when the rest of the city is gone, and it is stunning, and it is it really. It's ambitious. It makes the city feel greater than it is, and I think for a building to do that is extraordinary. And and I've gone around the world, and and I've sought out Gary's work for the same reason, and maybe what the Guggenheim did to Bilbao, the Sydney Opera House did to Sydney, years and years before, and it truly is astonishing. And I was so thrilled to be able to meet some of the men who worked on it, and there was a team of 600 men apparently who built that building.
Yeah, wow.
And the amazing thing about it was that the concrete factory basically that made all of the molds that created the building was literally out in front, so it was on site, and they would just sort of take those molds on. So it was just an extraordinary feat, and an Arab, like the original man, the man himself, was responsible for all of the engineering behind that, and Arab was as instrumental as Utzon, and what an extraordinary heritage that's provided for this city.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, that's a great note to end it on. Thanks for making the time for speaking with us on a Thursday your time. I was trying to do that math. Right, Thursday.
It's easy for me.
This was a lot of fun.
No, it's been so great. I really enjoyed talking to you both.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail. If you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion, feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.